Welcome back to Sunday School, everyone. I'm Jared Anderson, and this is Engaging Gospel Doctrine, episode 337, Even Though It Be a Cross, which covers the Come Follow Me material for June 23rd, New Testament Week 25. I find it unfortunate that the crucifixion and resurrection readings both fall on non-Sunday school weeks. This upcoming week is Priesthood and Relief Society, and then next week is under Bishop's direction. So when we come back around to a Sunday school week, I will give some suggestions about how we can integrate some of this pivotal atonement material into the reading in the beginning of Acts. We are covering the crucifixion of Jesus in this episode. Mark 15, Matthew 27, Luke 23, and John 19. My reading reflection is dealing with misunderstanding, abandonment, and failure, and this is a shift for me. I went into my preparation thinking about the crucifixion, thinking about Jesus' death. But after carefully reading the assigned chapters, I realized that death isn't the focus. And no, I'm not talking about resurrection being the focus or atonement being the focus. As we did with the Gethsemane chapters, we need to slow down. We need to unravel the pieces. We shouldn't jump too quickly into Jesus died for us, isn't that wonderful? We need to dig into the crucifixion. We need to allow it to be horrible, allow it to be a tragedy. I actually had breakfast with my undergraduate Hebrew teacher this morning and mentioned this episode, and she commented how she's Jewish background, as you can imagine, although she's secular herself. You can imagine how weird it is from the outside that Christians use one of the most torturous, horrible instruments of execution as the symbol for their religion. And of course, we can talk about why this is and why it makes sense and the subversion and turning upside down of that tragedy. But if we are to take this reading seriously, we need to let it be horrible. And that's what it is. Because, as I said, crucifixion is not about death. Crucifixion is about shame. Death can be clean, merciful, or relief. In hospice, I've mentioned before, there is the technical term, a good death. That is the goal of end of life, is you want a good death. We want to be prepared for death. We want to go peacefully, without much suffering, and we want our loved ones to be able to say goodbye, have some closure. Crucifixion is intended to make death last as long and horribly as possible. Elder Talmage goes into this in quite a bit of detail in Jesus the Christ. As most of you are familiar, during crucifixion, there were nails through the wrists and through the ankles. It seems that the knees were turned. At least we have a nail that was caught in an ankle bone, and it seemed that the legs were turned to the side and the nail was driven through the ankles, and basically the one crucified started suffocating, and the only way that they could breathe is to lift themselves up on the nail that was through their ankles. And they kept doing this until they became exhausted. Then they suffocated. Again, it was a maximally agonizing way to die. And I don't want to put undue emphasis on this, but I do want to make the point that crucifixion, the point of crucifixion was to serve as a warning for everyone else. Look at that poor sap. similar to public hangings. Except, again, crucifixion, the idea is that they would be alive for days while they were thirsty and hungry and in agony, which is why it's so surprising that Jesus died so quickly. So again, crucifixion is about shaming, it's about irony, it's about things turning out horribly opposite of what they should. So Jesus' death teaches us about feeling abandoned, being misunderstood, and having our greatest hopes and passions turned into a mockery. Think about it. After spending his ministry proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven has come near, after proclaiming in his ministry that God was going to radically heal the world, after living as if the kingdom had already come, after teaching that we must love each other in order to bring the kingdom, what happens after all this? After all this, Jesus is mocked and executed as a failed pretender king. And as I've been thinking about what we can learn from the crucifixion, how we can apply it to ourselves, the most painful thing I have ever experienced is people misunderstanding me. I really care about integrity. I really care about doing what's right. I'm painfully earnest and sincere. And there have been some times where people have, spread rumors, they've misunderstood me, they've mistook my intentions as darkly as possible, and there's nothing I've been through that's been worse than that, and that's a very high bar. I think the best I've been able to do is learn as much as I can from these experiences. I'm a better person for having gone through that, and live better every day. I've mentioned that I'm really proud of the way that I've been able to work at the prison. My prison work is near impeccable, and prisoners have nothing to do but pay super careful attention to what everyone does. And I've mentioned I've gotten called in, to my captain's office, what about this? And I hear this, and what are you doing? And I'm always glad to be able to explain why I'm doing. And so everything that we do should be defensible. But I've also been really sobered and humbled to realize that all of us live within the world of our own perceptions. And this is why relationships can be so painful. It's because no matter what we intend, our behavior functions in a certain way. And because of socialization, often we aren't aware of the way our behavior functions and the way we come across. And so people can sincerely think that we are, trying to hurt them, or, that we may have these intentions or hurtful behavior when we aren't trying to do any such thing. But again, this is why humility and direct communication is so important. That's the only thing that can repair relationships. And this is one of the core messages of atonement, is that every day our relationships broken and they must be reconciled. And again, that's the real beauty of living the gospel. This is also why social media is killing people. And I don't say that as an overstatement. Suicide, I think it's the second highest cause of death in America, second to heart disease, and especially among teenagers and the retired. And as best as I understand it, why social media is killing us is because social media caters and intensifies these passing judgments by thousands. There's comparison, there's perfectionism. Do you get dozens of likes or dislikes? I mean, I've mentioned before that even being on YouTube, thumbs down. What does the thumbs down mean? I can't talk to this person. I don't know who's giving me a thumbs down. Social media really runs counter to the way that relationships are supposed to work. We, in our world right now, we're lost, online in these virtual relationships, and we have fewer of these deep nourishing relationships that help us be healthy. So this is what struck me again as I read through these chapters, and I want to go through the reading and highlight these, ironic aspects. So I'll go through the reading and then I'll talk about the sayings of Jesus. So Mark is very direct, dramatic, straightforward. The chief priests with the elders and scribes, they take Jesus to Pilate. Pilate gets right to the point. He says, "Are you king of the Jews?" Because remember, Jesus was being accused of treason. That's the way that we would think of it. And that's what he wanted to know. He's like, are you an insurrectionist? Are you betraying the Roman Empire? Are you a threat the way that the Jews are telling me that you are? And then we have this story of someone being released during the festival. There's almost no chance that this is historical. Pilate was known to be brutal. Pilate was known to get in trouble even with the Romans. So this is literary irony. Barabbas means son of the father. And in Mark, Barabbas was an insurrectionist. So you have this irony that Barabbas, the so-called son of the father, who was actually guilty of treason, is let go, whereas Jesus, the real son of the father, who is being executed for something that he did not commit, a misunderstanding of his ministry. So again, you have this irony. Pilate says, this is the king of the Jews. And the irony is that Pilate, as portrayed in the Gospels, Pilate is actually a Christian saint in, I believe it's the Ethiopic or the Coptic church. I'm not sure which, so that's pretty crazy. And this is a trajectory that you will notice in the Gospels, that the Jews get more and more guilty and the Romans seem more and more innocent. I took a graduate course called The Rise of Anti-Judaism in Early Christianity, and it's very sobering, and we'll talk about some of the elements here. So again, the irony is that Pilate believes that Jesus is innocent of treason, and he's calling Jesus King of the Jews in order to appeal to the Jews to not kill him for treason. Do you see how that works? But the Jews say, crucify him, crucify him. And you get this irony in all the Gospels. It becomes more and more intense that Pilate is the one advocating to save Jesus, and the Jews who took Jesus to Pilate are the ones who are advocating for this Roman execution. So then we have the soldiers mocking Jesus. They dress him as a king. This is why he's wearing a crown of thorns. They put him in purple. They give him a scepter and they mock him, oh, you're a king. And in fact, crucifixion, why crucifixion was a very common execution method for insurrectionists, for treason, is it was that irony, setting up high. Oh, you wanted to be higher than everyone else. Well, now you're higher than everyone else. It was intended to be an ironic mocking death. And then we have Simon of Cyrene carrying Jesus's cross, which is a touching moment. Then, as we've discussed, we have the sign, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. There are other bandits or insurrectionists with Jesus, and they're mocking him. They're saying, you said that you could destroy the temple. You said you could rebuild it. Let's see if you can take it down. So again, the emphasis in these chapters is mockery, mockery, mockery. And this is where we have Jesus crying out to God, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, God, Father, why have you abandoned me? And I hope Jesus really said this, and I've said before that I believe Jesus died thinking his Father had abandoned him. And I myself have found it to be very helpful in my life to take very, very seriously Jesus's degree of feeling abandoned and feeling betrayed and feeling devastated. And I think that we can take this all seriously while also believing in the atonement and the resurrection and all of the meaning of this, but I find that by truly taking seriously the condescension of Jesus and the mortal experiences of Jesus, it helps me as I live my own mortal journey. This is really important. So what happens is once Jesus dies, the veil of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. So what's happening is the temple veil breaks, and the temple veil is separating the inner court from the Holy of Holies, the most holy sanctuary that represents the presence of God. And so what the Gospels are communicating with this is that with Jesus' death, we all have access to God. And this meaning is underscored when the centurion, the Gentile Roman centurion, says, truly this man was the Son of God. You know, up until this point, it's only the demons who recognize Jesus as the Son of God. Whenever the disciples try to recognize Jesus as the Son of God, he says, be quiet. It's only after Jesus' death when someone openly says, this was God's Son. This also communicates the idea that it is the death of Jesus that clarifies an understanding of Jesus' identity. We'll talk more about this next episode. So we have emphasized that it is Mary Magdalene. In all of the Gospels, Mary Magdalene is given pride of place. She is near the cross. She sees where he's buried. She goes to the tomb. She wants to take care of his body. I've mentioned before that I think Mary Magdalene is our best guess for Jesus's wife. Then we have this Joseph of Arimathea tradition where he asks Pilate for the body. He had riches and status, and so he gets the body. He puts Jesus probably in his own family tomb that would have been close to Jerusalem because he was high status. And this is another important thing to understand. The reason why they rushed Jesus into the tomb is so that the dead bodies would not defile the land on the Sabbath, and especially defile the land on the Sabbath of the Passover. The Gospel of John makes all of this explicit. It's not so much reverence for Jesus himself, it's reverence for Judaism and reverence for the land. And it would have made sense that Joseph of Arimathea would have put Jesus' body in his family tomb for the Sabbath, and then would have wanted to move Jesus, which is one historical explanation for the empty tomb. Okay, moving to Matthew, what is distinctive about Matthew? We have the death of Judas. This is only in the Gospel of Matthew. It's mentioned in Acts as well. In Acts, his guts spill out. Maybe he fell on a sword and he hangs himself. In the Gospel of Matthew, then the word was fulfilled. Prophet Jeremiah, they took 30 silver coins, the price of him on whom a price had been set by the sons of Israel. They gave them for the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. So we have this fulfillment of scripture emphasis as is common. Jesus before Pilate, again, only in the Gospel of Matthew do we have Pilate's wife. And I think it's really neat that there's an echo, it's like bookends. In the beginning, we have the Joseph's dream where the angel says, do not fear to take Mary as your wife. Mary is innocent. And then at the end of the gospel, we have Pilate's wife saying, Jesus is innocent. Please do not involve yourself. The chief priests and the elders are the ones who are pushing the crowds. And in Matthew and Luke, it is even more intense that the Jews are the one pushing and pushing and pushing for Jesus to be crucified, and Pilate is pushing and pushing and pushing for Jesus to be released. Again, I don't think this is historically plausible at all. I think what happened historically was Judas tipped off that Jesus was teaching that he was the Messiah to the priests and the scribes and the elders of the Jews after Jesus's symbolic action of the temple. they said to Pilate, this man is a danger to the Roman Empire, and Pilate said, okay, crucify him. There may have been some minor trial of like, you know, are you really king of the Jews? But I think that is the core from which all of this was expanded. And remember that in the Gospels and in Christianity in general, the Jews get more guilty and the Romans get more innocent, whereas the Jews would have had relatively little power and the Romans would have been the one fulfilling everything. Let's see, another distinction, two more distinctive elements in the Gospel of Matthew. One, you have a big earthquake and you have this really awkward resurrection weekend camping trip. And what I mean by that is as the earth shook, the rocks broke apart, and the graves were opened, and the bodies of many of the saints who had passed away arose, and they came out of the tomb after his resurrection. Now note what happens. Matthew is saying that at Jesus' death, rocks broke, the tombs were opened, the dead rose, but Matthew is experiencing a bit of a tension because on one hand, he wants to depict Jesus' death as the apocalyptic turning of the age, the end of this age and the beginning of the age to come, but he also knows that Jesus has to be the first fruits. Jesus has to be the first one resurrected, and that is why if you read carefully, it says that the dead rose, but they hung out in their graves for 36 hours or whatever until Jesus was resurrected. Okay, is it ready? And then they get up. The other thing that is interesting is there's a guard at the tomb. And the chief priests and Pharisees specifically say, the deceiver said while he was alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Let's guard the tomb so the disciples do not come and steal him and tell the people he has risen from the dead. So this is an indication of history, you know, textual analysis, and then a historian's art is reading carefully all of our sources and trying to figure out what is historically likely. And so this is a strong indication, and it makes good sense, that people were spreading rumors when, now I believe in the empty tomb, like I absolutely believe the tomb was empty when Jesus's followers came and they discovered the empty tomb. I don't think that Jesus' disciples were mistaken or were trying to trick anyone. I don't think they stole the body. I think they were genuinely shocked when they saw the tomb empty. And so in Matthew, Pilate says, you know, guard and secure the tomb, and we will talk about that next episode. Okay, now Luke 23, and I am sorry to say that Luke really lets me down in this chapter because I love the Gospel of Luke. It's probably my favorite. But the depiction of the crucifixion in Luke is very concerning because it is incredibly anti-Judaic. Now, there's no anti-Semitism in the Gospels because anti-Semitism is a racial theory that was based in 19th century race theories. But there is anti-Judaism in the Gospels. And what happened was the content of the Gospels was used for anti-Semitic purposes. It was used to justify the Holocaust. One more point that I didn't bring up when I covered Matthew was this poignant, terrible moment where Pilate washes his hands and he said, I am innocent of this man's blood. And then the Jews say, his blood be upon us and our children. And the interpretation and appropriation of that verse, it can be seen as justifying and perpetuating the horrific execution and even the Holocaust. You know, all the persecution of the Jews over the centuries was justified through these texts that we're reading right now. And we need to grapple with that. So this blew my mind in graduate school. Read Luke very carefully. The Jews crucify Jesus, or so it seems in the Gospel of Luke, because what the author of Luke does is in Mark and Matthew, the soldiers are mentioned before the crucifixion. They are the one mocking Jesus. But in Luke, mention of the soldiers is put later until after Jesus is already on the cross. So Luke really emphasizes the guilt and the proactivity of the Jews. The entire group of the Jews led him to Pilate. He says they are leading the entire nation astray. They are insistent. He stirs up the people. Pilate sends him to Herod, more Jewish involvement. The chief priests and scribes stood against him. Herod and his soldiers treated him shamefully and mocked him. So again, you have this Jewish level, not the Roman level. On Facebook, a listener asked who was who in the crucifixion, and that's a good question. So Pilate was probably one of the only Italians, as in Romans from Italy, in Judea at that time. Pilate's family was from, Roman Italy. All of the soldiers were likely local Middle Easterners who were conscripted or joined the Roman army. So there would have been a lot of, Semitic or Middle Eastern Roman soldiers, and probably only the leaders would have been, Italian Roman. And of course it was all, the Roman Empire and Roman soldiers. So again, Pilate emphasizes Jesus' innocence again and again and again. It says, Pilate wishing to set Jesus free, I have found nothing worthy of death. The Jews insisted. The vocal demands prevailed. They asked for him. He delivered Jesus according to their will as they led him away. In verse 26, this seems to be, like grammatically, it seems to still be referring to the Jews. And it says, they crucified him there. And then the soldiers aren't mentioned. The soldiers mocked him, approached him, offering sour wine. So again, that's the first mention of the soldiers. So that is really crazy. Another thing worth noticing is Jesus is very much in control in Luke. He's cool, calm, collected. He says, when the people are mourning, the women are mourning and lamenting, he says, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves, alluding to the destruction of Jerusalem. He speaks to the criminal, you will be with me in paradise. And he says, into your hands I commend my spirit. Luke and John are similar in that Luke is very much in control. He's not so much in agony. We don't have the cry of dereliction in Luke. We don't have this, my God, why have you forsaken me? Instead, you have, Jesus in control. In Luke, the centurion says, truly this was a righteous man. And as I mentioned last episode, this really blew my mind when I learned it. But again, in Luke, the atonement is not a vicarious atonement. It is a more traditional, repentance-based forgiveness. How it works in Luke is that we are motivated to repent and return to God, and Jesus is like that ultimate miscarriage of Jesus that motivates us to seek forgiveness from God. So we have, once again, Joseph of Arimathea. He's a good and righteous man. And then we have the women. Okay, again in John, as usual, John is very different. But the story of Jesus' arrest and death is closer to the other Gospels than anything else. It makes sense that there was an early passion narrative that all of the Gospel writers would have been familiar with. We have a lot more talking as usual. Pilate has him scourged. They are, we have this mocking King of the Jews, mocking irony, Pilate emphasizing guilt. Pilate says to Jesus, where are you from? Remember that this is one of the key emphases in John. Jesus is the man sent from heaven. And as he said in John 18, my kingdom is not of this world. And that is why Pilate is emphasizing his innocence. Shall I crucify your king? Again, we have these layers of irony where the Jews tell Pilate that Jesus is declaring himself king, as in a traitor to the Romans, and Pilate finds him innocent of being a king in a way that is treasonous to the Roman Empire, and then he pleads with the Jewish people, "Shall I crucify your king?" And it is very explicit in John, "We have no king except Caesar." I think Talmage has a disturbing comment that this was the moment when the Jewish nation executed itself or committed suicide or something. Jesus bears his own cross in John because he's super Jesus. And we have the disciple whom he loves. As I said before, I really like the idea of Mary as the beloved disciple. I think this is the best evidence in 25 and 26. The mother of Jesus and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene stood by the cross when Jesus saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing by. So the clearest reading of that portion of the text would be that Mary Magdalene was the beloved disciple. And then the argument goes that when John became more orthodox, they didn't like the idea of Mary Magdalene being the beloved disciple. So they said, oh, no one knows who the beloved disciple is, just this unnamed male disciple. Whereas in Gnostic literature, Mary Magdalene continues to be known as the disciple that Jesus loved. Again, we have Jesus's foreknowledge emphasized. Jesus knew that all things were already fulfilled. He says, "I thirst." He says it's finished. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And then John explicitly says that the bodies may not remain upon the cross during the Sabbath. And only in John do we have the victim's legs broken. I think that's plausible because remember, for the Romans, they wanted the victims of crucifixion to be on the cross as long as possible. In fact, as I understand it, they often let their bodies just rot on the cross because it's a warning. Don't mess with Rome or this will happen to you. But the Romans did concede to the Jewish concern for purity. And so because it was the Sabbath, because it was Passover, they took the bodies down and buried them. The other men on the cross would have been buried in a mass grave, and Jesus would have been buried in a mass grave if Joseph of Arimathea would not have intervened. We have Nicodemus as well helping Joseph of Arimathea in John, and Jesus is buried in a garden. Gethsemane it's not mentioned Gethsemane, but the arrest is in a garden and the burial is in a garden, not necessarily Joseph of Arimathea's, but in this tomb. And that is because in John we have this Eden renewal of creation symbolism. So again, it's really meaningful as we read the accounts of Jesus' death, and I was struck that it's not so much about Jesus' death because his death is a relief. It is the ending. The story of the crucifixion is one of grief and disappointment. And I find that the most powerful way that I can apply the crucifixion accounts to my life is Jesus teaching me how I can handle being mocked and misunderstood, and just dealing with that well. I want to read a little bit from my prison atonement talk because it applies to these chapters. Let's return to the Gospels. When the dying speak, we listen. How much more should we listen to the final words of Jesus? The Gospel records 7 statements from the cross, and Jesus' dying words teach us how to live, how to atone, how to find peace. Tradition names these statements the words of forgiveness, salvation, relationship, abandonment, triumph, and reunion. I'd like to briefly touch on how each of these apply to our own lives. Jesus' statements from the cross have powerful lessons for us to ponder and practice. His first statement is perhaps the most striking as it is spoken to those who struck him, beat and flogged him mercilessly. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. We've talked about human limitation. Do any of us really know what we are doing? Even if people are cruel, usually that cruelty stems from hidden wounds. Are we able to use our understanding of human limitation to increase our forgiveness? Next, Jesus notices the man crucified at his side. Perhaps this man was guilty of those crimes Jesus himself was accused of. The man himself acknowledges his guilt, the justness of even the terrible penalty of crucifixion. And Jesus extends grace toward this gracious, fair comment and says, "Truly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise." When others admit they are wrong, do we meet that honesty with grace and extend to them reconciliation? After soothing the stranger, Jesus speaks to his family, linking family of birth with family of choice. He repairs and realigns relationships. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. Do we nurture our family of choice? Do we use our words and actions to connect even when we ourselves are in pain? The next two statements from the cross have resonated with me in my darkest moments. In agony, Jesus screams, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." God, Father, why have you abandoned me? Why have you left me alone when I need you the most? Do we have the courage and vulnerability to admit when we feel alone and abandoned? Jesus also speaks up for his needs when he says, "I thirst." Finally, simply, Jesus says, "It is finished." The Greek here is tetelestai. It is complete. It has been finished. Jesus expresses his fear and vulnerability, but we also have traditions that express his affirmation and trust. As a quick historical and literary aside, so devotionally, I think those sayings, the 7 sayings from the cross, are very powerful and worth meditating on. Literarily and historically, I do not think that Jesus said all of those things. I think we have a tradition that he screamed out on the cross. I think it's plausible that he quoted Psalm 22:1 and said, "Why have you abandoned me, Father?" I think all the rest is Christian imagining and projection. What is the meaning of Jesus' death? And we'll dig a lot more into that in the next episode. The last thing I want to talk about for this reading reflection is letting our past selves die and be buried. Romans 6:6 talks about crucifying our old self. In Adam Miller's paraphrase of Romans, he says, "Our old way of being human was crucified with Jesus. Our old bodies, our old habits, our old desires died with him." I've mentioned before that I thought my divorce would kill me, and it did. In a way, that was my crucifixion. I've been talking with my oldest and, thinking back to the ways that I've dramatically changed over the last 3 years. And my second divorce was the last thing I wanted, and it killed that version of me in a really important way, and I'm really grateful and proud of the version of myself that I've become. But this version of myself required that crucifixion and death of my old self, and I'm grateful for that. Next week, we will cover the resurrection, Mark 16, Matthew 28, Luke 24, John 20 and 21. Because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I want to reissue Carolyn Pearson's Holy Week because I mispronounced a few words. I love this idea that life after death is always bigger than life before death, and I can certainly bear witness to that. In conclusion, Jesus' death invites us to reflect, what meaning is there in death? What meaning is there in those events that make you want to die? That's that crucifixion. Because the purpose of crucifixion is to make you want to die and unable to die. That's torture. You know how in those gangster movies, someone always says, I will make your death quick, or make it quick. There's that understanding that what is worse than death is wanting to die and not being able to. And so that's what torture is. Torture is being in agony and not being able to do anything about it. And that is the message of crucifixion. And I have certainly had my share of those experiences, and I have metabolized them the best I can. I have learned as much as I can from them. All of this, even humiliation and regret, enriches life, and it adds that meaning in life. Next week, we'll talk about how Jesus' followers found meaning in Jesus' unexpected death. Remember that we know how the story ends. We have hindsight. We are reading after the fact. But as a historian, I can tell you that Jesus' death came as an absolute shock, probably to him and certainly to his followers. Luke 24 communicates this very clearly. So again, I pray that this week we can reflect on those difficult moments of our lives, those moments when we have been misunderstood and even mocked, and that we can show grace and love and transformation even with those difficult moments. Thank you to all of you who keep this podcast sustainable. If you are able to support the podcast, we're still at a low level of support. Thank you to all those who have supported. But again, thank you for joining me for another episode. I've had a really hard week. That's why my energy is a bit low, but hey, might be appropriate for this crucifixion episode. But I'm grateful to be able to do this podcast, and I thank you for your support.